All right, beautiful people. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we are visited by Miho Soon. Miho is a product designer, former entrepreneur and researcher, and her experiences working with migrants and refugees, which helped her shape a trauma-informed approach to design, integrating the bridge between psychological resilience, economics, social science, and technological design practices. And she's coming today to present on an idea, a turtle question that she's been working on, money trauma. This will be a participatory session, and she'll be sharing her ongoing research on how the economic stress and trauma show up in the way we navigate the economy, and then provide a space for a discussion around trauma-informed principles that could be applied in the creation of new systems. And how today's going to work, it's going to be a 45-minute presentation with some breaks in between, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. And if you have questions anytime, just pop it in the chat. And if you want me to read your question on your behalf, I can do that because this will be on YouTube. Otherwise, I'll just call you and you can ask your question to Miho. And we're here for 90 minutes in total. So that being said, Miho, welcome to the Stoa, and take your it. I'm handing you the keys.
Amazing. Thank you, Peter. I think I'm going to go ahead and share my screen first, and then I'll give a little bit more of an intro. Welcome to Money Trauma. Just going to try to pull up my notes on the side as well. Can everyone see my screen all right? You can just see the money trauma bit, right? You can't see my notes on the side. Cool, perfect. All right. So, as Peter said, I'm Miho Soon. I never thought I would be exploring a subject like money trauma. I avoided the topic of money for most of my life. It was an extremely fear-based subject for me until I worked in crypto, in Web3. And back then, I was tasked with to be a product designer and to work on working on designing complex financial products for regular people. And in this time, I just realized people's behavior with money wasn't rational at all. And that made me think a little bit more into my own backstory. So I'm originally from Malaysia, and I grew up in the derogatory term new money. My parents came from extreme poverty. My grandfather was addicted to heroin. And within my lifetime, my parents and a lot of the people around me suddenly accrued more wealth than they've ever had before. And I realized, even though they had material wealth, it wasn't like their relationship with money was healthy either. There was a lot of gambling in the family, a lot of financial stress spending, and just a lot of what economists call irrational behavior. And so I started asking myself a deeper question, which is what is actually driving this? And I wasn't satisfied with the kind of scarcity mindset answer. And I then spoke to a financial therapist and discovered the concept of financial trauma, which was whoa, how is this so underexplored? How is no one talking about this? So I decided to explore it from a more systemic perspective. So 90% of all financial behaviors are made emotionally, despite the fact that in the world of product design, economics, mostly it is still treated very rationally. The structure today of what I'll go through is, first of all, what is financial and economic trauma? Just kind of diving deep into how does it show up for us personally, and then going into a broader vision of how does it show up collectively for us as a culture, and then ideate what it would look like to create a more trauma-informed vision of what our lives could look like, as well as for the systems around us. Just a heads up that I am not a therapist. I probably could help you a little bit with some of your money problems and with certain questions, but my personal mission is to make a more systemic analysis, as I do not believe this is something that should just be left for people to solve in therapy just by themselves. So I hope you'll get a deeper way of thinking about money, self-worth, and the way we navigate the economy through this for whatever you're doing. So I'm going to be doing like 2 breaks in between all of these sections. And I just want to tell you that in the past, when I've done these sessions, it can be triggering for people. So this is a heads up that it's totally cool to keep your camera off whenever you want to and just kind of sit back, drink some water. And if it's really too triggering and you want to leave the meeting, that is okay with me too. I will not take it personally. So with that, I'll jump in. So trauma nowadays is still kind of in the mainstream associated with big natural like disasters, war, accidents, violence, these kinds of big events that are at the worst case just kind of like prescribed onto people like soldiers. And with the Me Too movement, there's now more attention on like sexual violence, and with racism, racial violence. But these kinds of events are still concentrated just on one big event. Psychologists call this big T trauma. What's lesser explored though is little t trauma. Little t trauma comes up from like more ordinary life experiences that kind of everyone goes through. It can come up when we feel bullied at work, or go through chronic financial stress, or go through a very traumatic breakup. But I don't really like the framing of little t, because little doesn't necessarily mean that the effect on our brains and bodies are any lesser. Just to go into a little bit more, what is trauma? Trauma at its very, very core, in a very simplistic way of explaining it, is a really intelligent survival response. If we were faced with an imaginary bear back in the day, our bodies release a lot of cortisol and trigger the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response. This helps us escape, appease, or try to control the situation so we can leave the bear and return back to our communities and feel safe with them. Trauma is something that helps us remember that this bear is dangerous, or anything that looks like it, and so we may avoid it in the future. But what happens when this bear is something a little bit more abstract today, like, you know, being bullied at work, not being able to pay the bills, you know, seeing your parents go through a struggle and not wanting to like be in the same situation as them? Money and work are fundamentally tied in with survival, belonging, and our identity these days. And I don't think there's a more powerful framing than framing it as trauma. 1 in 4 Americans have PTSD-like symptoms caused by financially induced stress. Just a heads up also that a lot of my statistics in this presentation are American. It goes to show that this topic is extremely underexplored. So I hope that there will be more in the future, and I would like to work on this too, but just a bit of a heads up. So what is financial and economic trauma? Financial and economic trauma is a dysfunctional response that we have around money, work, identity, all things kind of under the economic umbrella that are a result of going through chronic financial stress. This may be during your adulthood, if you can't pay the bills for a long time and you have to make sacrifices for things that you don't otherwise want to give up on. It can also be a result of childhood poverty. There's a lot of studies about childhood developmental trauma and how it has an impact on our brains. Poverty is also deeply connected with other forms of violence, like racial violence, domestic violence, and all sorts of other things too, that, you know, manifest as trauma in our bodies. It can also be informed by toxic cultural norms, trying to live up to certain expectations that we have to live up to conform in society, and also perhaps in generational trauma. Generational trauma is my story a lot of the time. Sorry, just having a computer backup moment. So a lot of the time, how trauma kind of gets integrated in our bodies is when we feel threatened and we're unable to kind of process the feelings of stress in our bodies, what happens is we start internalizing it ourselves. And these may show up in negative narratives that we prescribe onto ourselves, such as in money. No matter how much money I have, I still don't feel like I have enough. Money doesn't come easily to me. If I don't have enough money, I am on my own when crisis strikes. My parents suffered, and I don't want to suffer like them. So I need to do everything to be secure at all costs. Or in my case, I have no idea how I keep losing money every month. I go in a trance and it's all lost. What I found exploring these beliefs even deeper was I got interested in how we project these views that we carry onto the wider world as well. If you've ever heard of the statement, "You're projecting on me," I got interested in what exactly does that mean? Like how is that actually survival instinct that protects us? I found out that projections are a way of protecting our own self-esteem when we feel like we have bad feelings, characteristics, habits, or impulses that we cannot accept as part of ourselves. And so it's kind of like this Carl Jung shadow theory, where we put down and hide away the parts of us that we find unacceptable, but somehow it still leaks out into the wider world. In money narratives, these can look like outwards resentment towards people who have money while feeling envious internally, criticizing others for poor financial behavior while harboring shame about mismanagement myself. In our career, which is inherently tied in with our self-worth, narratives could look like, if my children don't choose a lucrative career, they're not going to survive. This is a huge thing in my culture, in Chinese culture. It's probably a well-known thing amongst everyone that the classic Chinese parents force us children to choose, like, to be a doctor, to go into law, into finance. And of course, if you ask them deeper into why that is, it's because of a security orientation that the culture has adopted. On a more personal note, it could look like, I need to go above and beyond the workplace, or else I'm not going to be accepted. I'm never going to have a good career. My career is so difficult for me, but not for other people. Or in the projection note, a chronic envy and romanticization onto others who are successful. All of these career beliefs I have inherited before, especially during my years when I struggled immensely when I lived in London and I was unable to get a visa. And I saw all my friends go to work, get the job, start their careers, and I was not allowed to. And my response was to kind of try the best as possible to be the best immigrant I could be, but kind of holding all of these shameful beliefs deep down inside. And it's, of course, a story for a lot of people as well. How trauma also affects our brains and our bodies is it compresses our ability to emotionally regulate ourselves. So emotional regulation is our ability to, when we have a very stressful emotion, to kind of calm down and not let it continue and return back into a secure and kind of calm state. So of course, this manifests itself in chronic anxiety, depression, being unable to break out of anger or despair cycles. It could result in higher impulsivity, hypervigilance, paranoia, which has a concrete relationship to the way we navigate handling money, and also to work relationships and relationships in general. I'll be going into that a little bit later. And it also affects our executive function, which is the prefrontal cortex ability to manage problems, learn new things, engage in long-term thinking and complex thinking. And of course, this makes sense. Like if you're chronically stressed, you're focused on like one very small thing specifically. And over time, this actually changes the way that our brain functions as well. Returning a little bit back to the kind of rationalism narrative around money, especially towards like people in the working class, but more and more increasingly to everyone, people have these narratives that people should make financial behaviors rationally. We should be able to know how to properly invest. properly manage like how much we spend in this way, in this very kind of quantified container sort of manner. People should be able to manage their own money responsibly. And my least favorite one, which is you just have to shift your scarcity mindset into an abundant one. Just like close your eyes and change your money story, just like that. It's that simple. For such a long time, I tried to do this. I moved between financial avoidance and kind of criticizing myself for not being able to kind of go into a state of calm whenever I think about money, but this was just not possible. And then this kind of all changed for me when I spoke to a financial therapist who really like walked me through the subject. And he told me that, so a lot of clients come in to his office and they're like, Richard, I'm overspending. And he first goes to them, okay, well, have you tried setting up like a savings account over there and making a proper financial plan? Do this, do that. And only about 20% of the time they go, oh yeah, okay, like that's great. No one's ever told me that. Problem's all solved. 80% of the time they say to him, I've tried everything, but it just doesn't work because it's a deeply emotional problem. And it pours into the way I manage money. And so he kind of works with people in this more trauma-informed way. So what exactly is happening when we go into overspending, for example, or I go into overspending? I want to talk a little bit about the human stress responses right now, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. To just give a brief introduction about what it is, the difference between a stress response and a trauma response is that in a stress response, we are responding to current threats. So if you are in a toxic workplace and you're being overworked, you are having a stress response to current scenarios. In a trauma response, you might be, in an extremely healthy working place. People might respect you a lot. You might be in healthy relationships, but you'll still be kind of reacting from things from the past. Stress responses and trauma responses both look quite similar, and I want to advocate for a higher literacy into how they show up. There's really little literature about how it shows up with money and work. Most of it kind of stays within the kind of attachment theory relationship realm. And I kind of had to dig through like so many sections of the internet and speak to financial therapists to kind of compilate this information. So first off, I'm going to talk about the fight response. So the fight response is exactly how it sounds. When we think that we are more powerful than the threat in front of us. Our bodies shoot up with cortisol. We become bigger than we are so that we can face the bear and control it. It is a very powerful stress response, and it is often like one of the most destructive in relationships as well. The fight response shows up in narratives such as, they're out to hurt me and I have to fight back. I am right, you are wrong, or how dare you? Going a little bit deeper into it, the fight response could look like chronic anger, irritability, and frustration, lashing out, having sudden outbursts, and kind of struggling to calm down afterwards, overthinking cycles, and more extreme cases, narcissism. Behaviors could look like using money as a tool for manipulation and control, impulse investing, to compensate for losses. If you suddenly have kind of lost a little bit of money in your investments, you might suddenly be like, you know what, I'm just going to throw everything in, and being obviously very detached from how I should rationally behave with money. It could also look like threats, such as taking legal action or threatening people with money. In relationships at work, it could look like defensiveness, competitiveness, micromanagement of others, being demanding and controlling. And in more extreme cases, bullying, assault, physical and emotional violence. The fight response is something that I personally struggled with a lot in my early 20s. And it's kind of like a trance that And all of these stress responses feel like a trance that are kind of automatically turned on in your body. And if you don't kind of pay attention to it and have like a literacy for what's going on, it's kind of hard to spot and calm down. The next response is the flight response. The flight response is when we think that the bear is more powerful than us and we should run. However, in modern society, because there's no bear in front of us, usually, like most of the time, and we're stuck in the situation where sometimes, we may be in front of a threatening person at work, it manifests in mental escape. So this looks like avoidance. I can't face this. I want to run away from this feeling. The flight response could look like excessive distraction and procrastination, going into kind of creating your own fantasy of what an alternative world could look like and kind of focusing on that instead of being where you are. It could look like impulse purchasing and financial decision-making, dopamine cycles. This is going to make me feel better. I'm going to just buy this thing. Pleasure seeking and addiction to consumerism, excessive content consumption, or perhaps, I'm just going to sell all my assets because it's too risky to hold on to. At work, it could look like procrastination or perfectionism and workaholism as a way to escape, or conflict avoidance. I've got 2 more responses to go through, and then we'll do a little bit of a break. The freeze response is something that's kind of harder to spot a lot of the time, because a lot of extremely high functioning people could also be in this response. But the kind of main hallmark of it is that we are dissociated from our bodies and our emotions. It is described in, I can't overpower the bear, or I can't run away, so I'm going to make myself as small as possible, as non-threatening as possible, so that I may, escape it. It could look like narratives such as, I can't do it, I don't know what to choose because I'm so dissociated from my body and my emotions, or I don't know how or what I feel. In more extreme cases, it could look like self-numbing, using drugs, self-neglect, giving up on managing work and personal finance, giving up on taking care of personal health, financial avoidance, being stuck and unmotivated, or being unable to make decisions for yourself and relying on other people. The last response is something I only kind of intuitively integrated in myself recently, and is a really scary and kind of perverse response, and shows up highly in immigrants, marginalized communities, and women when we run out of all survival strategies and believe that the only way we can get out of this is to appease the bear. Maybe like we decide that we want to feed the bear something, or try to please it. And a really derogatory way of kind of describing this response is by calling people people pleasers, or people who kind of, what's the other term? People pleasers, or people who can't stand up for themselves. And this is exactly what this survival response tries to achieve in order for us to survive the threat. It could look like over apologizing. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it like that. Or the best way to avoid conflict is to please them, and that fundamentally becoming a belief. A lot of the times, people with less privilege are put in these positions because, for Black Americans, if you stand up against police violence, you're a dangerous person and you risk incarceration. If you're an immigrant, you face perhaps, in extreme cases, being deported or being fired from a job where your visa is tied into it. And it's really, really hard to see and disentangle this response. So this could look like a lack of personal boundaries, difficulty saying no, I have to keep pleasing, I have to keep showing up no matter what happens because my survival counts on it. A denial and disconnection with personal needs, desires, fears, and complaints. and exhaustion from overthinking and anxiety on how to not cause conflicts. In money, this could look like a lack of financial self-worth, a difficulty making the case for myself because I'm small and disconnected from my needs to earn more money, overspending on other people, and in extreme cases in relationships at work, turning a blind eye to injustice to maintain personal safety. So the next section is a kind of broader exploration into how economic trauma is systemic. So the previous presentations I did were more focused because I am a product designer on financial technologies as this kind of new kind of ways of tools for people to acquire wealth and whether they serve them or not. For this presentation specifically, I'm more interested in focusing on culture. So just to reiterate my original points, I believe that economic and financial trauma should not just be a personal matter for therapy. It's amazing how there's such a bigger awareness now of mental health, in certain bubbles, but it feels like such a surface level solution that easily distracts us from the bigger picture, and that trauma doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's obviously things within all of these kinds of sites of shaping that shape, the choices that we make, the expectations we're supposed to live up to, and whether or not these things become helpful to us. And so I kind of went into a deeper inquiry, and this is part of my turtle question that I'm still exploring, of to what extent are human stress responses driving obsessiveness with wealth and status, hustle culture, gender wage inequality, toxic masculinity, the hush-hush silent culture around money, and the romanticization of consumerism. I love this quote by Resna Manikim, who is a Black American trauma specialist exploring intergenerational trauma in the Black American context. He says that trauma decontextualized in a person looks like personality. In a family, it looks like family traits. And zooming out above in a people can look like culture. I'm now going to go into a very specific example that some of you may have thought about before, but I haven't really seen a kind of trauma-informed analysis on it. Social welfare and the attitudes towards it. So in left-wing movements, you will see a huge push towards more social welfare, whether that's universal basic income, universal basic services, stronger social movements. Depending on what the policy recommendation is, there is enough evidence to show that stronger social welfare, improves health conditions, reduces inequality, etc. And yet there's so much resistance, even in a country like Germany, that's still a welfare state, which was like really shocking to me. When I first moved to Germany, before that I lived in London, I was kind of shocked when I was given welfare during the pandemic. I had just arrived as a freelancer and I lost all my work because of the pandemic, and the government gave me 1,000 euros a month. And I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Like the government is actually helping me out and making sure that I don't become bankrupt. This is amazing. And I was kind of talking about it to my German friends, wow, you have such an amazing system. This is incredible. And then being very confused as well about why they seem to still have a very negative relationship to money. And then going a little bit deeper, this kind of prompted my exploration here. So 52% of Americans, based on a study in 2017, oppose universal basic income, while between 48 to 55% of Germans oppose it too. And if you look beneath the reasons people oppose it, beyond just kind of how should we implement it? What are protocols that we can make it sustainable? We'll see narratives such as welfare stigma. People who get handouts don't work hard while the rest of us do. People are just going to buy useless things like tobacco and alcohol. People are going to get lazy. In Germany, they say the standard of living for the unemployed is too high. And lastly, immigrants don't deserve welfare. Even amongst the universal basic income movement, even the people who support it, the majority of people think that immigrants shouldn't actually be recipients of that. Some percentage of them say that after a year, maybe immigrants can take it after they contribute into the tax system. Some say that only after they've gotten their passport, they can get welfare. And in extreme cases, they don't deserve welfare at all, which is what the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party in Germany, advocates for. Going a little bit deeper into this, I got interested in what is the human experience beneath stigma, and why is it occurring, and why does it feel so strong, and how exactly do we internalize it? Speaking to my German friends, a lot of my working class German friends grew up with this extremely disgusting derogatory TV show about recipients of something called the Hartz-IV. The Hartz-IV is a welfare program that helps working class Germans kind of have a basic income. And the TV show goes into people's homes and talks about how, for example, Klaus has been unemployed for 25 years. Look at him, he's just sitting there. Look at how fucked up his children are. There was a movement that came afterwards that exposed directly how this TV show spewing these narratives led them to make more profit, obviously, negative economic incentive. I spoke to a German Turkish friend of mine who told me her story about how welfare stigma affected her growing up. So I'll just read out a little bit of it. When I was working at the Fraunhofer Institute a few years ago, my colleague asked me the question I was always terrified of. What is your mother doing? For the first time, I felt confident enough to be vulnerable and told him that she is unemployed and receiving Hartz-IV. His response was one that I've heard before. Really? Why? I explained that my mother was a single mother who had came to Germany from Turkey and worked in 7 different places before being let go because she had to pick me up from kindergarten. She couldn't find a job after that, so she decided to be there for me. My colleague expressed concern about his taxes going to people like my mother, who he believes are taking advantage of the system. Welfare stigma is something that is prominent globally. And the components of how it actually affects people are these 4 things. So a person will feel embarrassed, ashamed, inferior. They might, due to this, withdraw socially, avoid those people or those topics, kind of fragmenting themselves, feeling inadequate, and start internalizing the fact that maybe they're not capable of achieving that much. The most perverse one is that, and that's kind of tied in with shame, is that we'll start to endorse these stereotypes for ourselves, being like, you know what, maybe I am an immigrant that is a burden on society. Maybe I need to be working harder. Maybe there's actually, it actually is shameful for me to be unemployed right now, even though I'm going through a hard time and I just had a burnout. Self-stigma, the way we internalize stigma, is a socially induced symptom of trauma where narratives become internalized as the truth. And the sad thing, and I see this so much in Malaysia, where I'm from, is that the victims of stigma will continue to perpetuate it amongst themselves as well. I see this as a form of projection. There was a study by the Leibniz Information Center for Economics in Germany that found the higher the level of social support a person received, the more internalized stigma and shame they inherited. They called this phenomenon social jealousy. And I would also like to frame it as a projection due to trauma. Another German friend of mine shared with me an astounding story that she became a single mother at 19 and that her own working class family repeatedly shamed her for taking the German state welfare. and saying, you're not working for your own money. Like us, we've been working for our money our whole lives, but like she was a single mother at 19. And it's just kind of astounding to me. And thus I kind of started to ask the question of like, looking at the way that a lot of social welfare movements approach communication these days and how they approach advocacy in the kind of greater scope. There's a lot of most of the movement approaches it through like telling people facts about how it's going to help them better, but they never kind of get to this deeper level of like, how is actually stigma existing in the people themselves as they walk through society. And so if we acknowledge this deepest wound that a lot of us carry in narratives around money and self-worth, I want to know, how might we reimagine a more profound movement towards collective well-being? I am going to go now into the final section of my presentation, healing economic trauma. So there's a reason that I explore this topic, and I think even though it's something that's extremely confronting to explore, I feel a beacon of hope, because there's a reason why so many people go to therapy, and there's reasons why it works. And I think there's something powerful about reframing these things as trauma, because we know that trauma can be healed. Researchers such as Gabor Mate, Bessel van der Kolk, Thomas Hubel, and tens and thousands of other practicing psychotherapists and social workers have dived into how to change our responses in life from a fear-driven one into something that's more re-empowered and holistic. I asked Richard Kaler, the financial therapist, this question: what is financial well-being? And he laughed because he said no one had ever asked him that. And he went away and compiled this for me. He described financial well-being as having enough money to be able to meet ongoing obligations, feeling secure enough to meet ongoing obligations, as well as the uncertainties of life, able to make choices to enjoy life, and money is able to support our quest for meaning. Only about 1 out of 4 of these is a rational, having enough money in the bank account thing. The rest of it is inherently emotional. And this brings me to the question of like, what would happen if we, were able to have a higher literacy for ourselves to how to actually feel secure financially and at work? Transformation is when we have new options and choices. It's when we can make different moves and have different conversations that are aligned with our values, visions, and what we are committed to. Much of my research, as I said before, is how to do this in product design specifically. But I'm kind of expanding it at the moment to kind of broader things like organizational design, as well as like cultural narratives, like the kind of stigma example I gave to you just now. And I'm in the process of exploring the intelligence and wisdom of people who have transformed the lived experience of people around all these topics. And I'm going to be publishing these in my newsletter and my podcast coming up. And these are the 2 main guiding questions. What would happen if we had the literacy for stress responses for ourselves and beyond, after looking at ourselves, the communities we're in, the people we serve? And how can we create the containers that are able to facilitate deeper meaning for all of us in the deepest way possible? I'm now going to go into 2 of my favorite examples of people I've interviewed, where I really admire the way they've kind of turned around and looked at things from a deeper manner. The first example is Even. So Even is a fintech company in America. Before I explain it a little bit more, fintech is going through this kind of trend where it tries to reduce bureaucracy and disrupt existing financial structures and risk mitigation by automation. But what actually happens is that it puts more responsibility on consumers to make good decisions for themselves, getting more people into debt. I explore a lot of this in my own research, which I don't really have time to go into right now, but I love the way Even has approached this problem instead. So Even had this mission of getting working class Americans that were working at Walmart specifically out of the paycheck to paycheck cycle. And they thought, we're just going to give people low interest loans. We're just going to give people more money, so more credit, so they can handle the stresses of life a little bit better, which is this very common narrative that a lot of fintech crypto companies have. Let's just give people easier to access credits. And while this is super important, it negates the fact of how people actually handle money under stress. They found that a lot of the people who received the loans failed to pay it back and accrued even more interest moving forward. And so they were like, hold on, wait, like what's actually going on here? And how can we cater to our customers in a deeper way? They did a lot of research into how their customers were behaving with money under stress and came up with these solutions. So knowing that, first of all, in a climate where 60% of Americans cannot afford a bill of over $400, they were like, okay, like, why is this? And they found that people struggle to pay back loans because they were under a lot of financial stress, and therefore they struggle to plan and struggle to like be able to have a full kind of picture of money and inflows and outflows. So they decided to bear the cost of the loans by working with Walmart themselves. They encouraged reflection about how to pay back the loans with the aid of planning tools. And they automatically deducted savings from income, which is a kind of behavioral economics finding that when you automatically save for people instead of giving people that responsibility, you opt in instead of opt out, it actually helps them save a lot more. And they helped save a total of $350 million for their employees, which I found really, really impressive. The next example is a local German organization called the Dive. So the Dive is they help big organizations in Germany, I think like Deutsche Bahn, rethink how to turn their business into more values aligned, more regenerative means. And I really respect them because they kind of test internally amongst themselves as well first, before they roll it out to the new company. And they were running into the problem of like, okay, well, if we want to really be regenerative and sustainable, we need to also think about how we're paying our own employees internally. So they decided to look at wage inequality within the company in a deeper way. So movements typically try to advocate for more wage transparency in their processes to show, you know, how much is the CEO earning versus how much another employee is earning. But I love that they go a step ahead of that because they recognize that trauma, stigma, and culture have a significant impact on people's inherent financial self-worth and how much you're actually going to ask for, even if the transparency was there in the beginning. And so they created a salary system that creates the right conversations and processes that facilitate people really asking what they're worth, by also comparing it to how much the company is currently earning, and just creating this destigmatized environment where they can have a realistic conversation about like, you know, how can we best help you? How much debt do you have? And how can we all move forward together? I can't talk so much about their salary system in detail because they're releasing it in March 2023, but I encourage you to follow them. I am coming to the end of my presentation now, where I want to say that I believe we all have the power to create new containers to transform economic trauma. If you are interested in learning a little bit deeper about trauma transformation frameworks, you can ask me a question and I can give you insights about where to go. And I will be publishing more on my Substack and on my podcast. And yeah, like I really don't want to do this alone. And because this is not just my story, but everybody's story. And so I really want to invite whoever has some interesting insights or directions of kind of joining me on this process. So yeah, thank you. Oh, and I want to give a special thanks to my amazing friends who have inspired me and encouraged me during this process. Thank you.
Awesome. So let's give a silent round of applause for Miho. That was an excellent presentation. I quite enjoyed it. So thank you for delivering that with such care and consideration. So if you have any questions, pop it in the chat, pop your question in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can ask your question to Miho. I'll warm up the Stoa with a question. We're here for another 30 minutes. Is that right, Miho? You're good for another 30 minutes?
Yeah, I'm here for another 30 minutes.
Cool. So the first question, I guess I'll start with a share. I noticed that the presentation, like while the presentation was excellent, there's a part of me that just wanted to like look away, just like kind of like distract myself with something else. And it felt like it's something more deeply rooted. So I felt like it was a nice meta move notion that like feeling the money trauma while paying attention to it. So my first question is this sort of bi-directional pull I feel, and I think many people feel, that are like plugged into somatic awareness, trauma awareness type stuff. It's like this desire to do the work and like find that container, that space, that sacred container and space to process, not only process one's trauma, but like build the literacy in order how to wisely address it in the future. And then what I find is that, okay, that takes a lot of effort, a lot of time to do that. And then oscillate to like maybe engaging in the fight response, like, okay, I just gotta make money right now because something's come up. And then I like, because the fight response energy is effective. It's proven to me to be effective in making money. And so I was wondering if you can kind of explain or speak more on that oscillation. And is there like a healthy fight response or like a proactive way to consciously pursue making money? And maybe that contrast the fight response way versus the more proactive, healthy way.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I want to preface to say again, like, I'm not a therapist. So like, I can only share my kind of personal knowledge and experience with this. But I think that in the end, a lot of these things are survival responses, right? And they're there to help us. And if they actually do in the end, that's a good thing. I think when we need to examine them is when a part of it becomes out of control. I certainly love a lot of my fight responses that exist inside of me as well today. Speaking of the oscillation, just touching upon that, I think for me personally, I don't think it's realistic for a lot of people to just kind of create that container to hide and examine everything all at once. Nor do I think a lot of therapists and practitioners also say that's the most effective thing, because it's about learning and then applying and going back into real life and responding differently. And I would say the oscillation is always going to be there. Like, it's more like how effectively we can kind of dance with it.
It's going to be a jerky ride. I find that I'm going back and forth. All right, so let's.
It's like if you create like the right conversations around you, also of people who are able to kind of respond and mitigate. I'm very inspired by my own community in Berlin and how over a period of time we've all become more trauma literate and are able to be like, they can tell, my friends can tell when I'm in a stress response and kind of engage with me on that and then help me kind of calm down or figure out a way to break out of it if it feels unhealthy for me, but also just to create the space for me to continue being in it if that's the only thing that's helpful for me right now.
Yeah, totally. And you got a good set of people in Berlin to help you with that for sure. All right, so if we're gonna go to the Q&A, if you have any questions, pop in the chat. Laura, you had a question or two.
Yeah, actually, first off, I'll just disclaim that I was in most of this presentation while having my teeth cleaned at the dentist. I shared that with you earlier, Peter. So I might have missed things, but I think I was able to follow mostly. And a couple of things. One, I was curious if you had looked at all at the impacts of 12-step programs around money. So I know there's there are 12-step programs, and 12-step programs generally work in a kind of like collective cognitive behavioral therapy kind of model where it's like, yes, get rid of the shame and, you know, have support and have kind of like a meaning layer added and things like that. So I'm curious if you have looked at those for any kind of knowledge about trauma-informed money stuff.
I used to be in 12 steps myself for inner child work, specifically for adult children. So that like, it just immediately kind of brought me back to that. And I have heard of Debtors Anonymous, but no, I haven't actually been looked at it in the money specific way. And that is prompting me to want to check it out. So I'm going to write it down. Thank you for that. 12 steps. No.
Any follow-up question or share, Laura?
Sorry, trying to unmute. No, I just want to appreciate this presentation. I think that I'm working on a project actually, Miho, that maybe I'll connect with you outside of this, that has some overlap, but the idea, the sort of cultural impact of believing that people should be, you know, like be able to pay for things, and if they can't, then it's like shame on them, is I think something I see a lot in at least US culture, and and definitely around tech world. So, you know, I think just confronting that and saying like, why is that a thing, is really interesting, and I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, back to you. Are you exploring the intersection also between that, like tech world, perceptions, narratives?
Yes, indirectly, and also I have ironically a client project that this intersects with. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, let's connect.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. Anna Marie, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, hello. Miho. It's lovely to see you. I'm curious about when in groups, communities or organizations, whether you found that naming potential money or career dynamics that might be in the room can be really helpful to mitigating trauma responses.
Yes, I absolutely believe so. And I think there's a guy called Joe Brewer.
Yes, I know Joe. Yeah.
Yes. And he's done that specifically in kind of organizations and thinking about how they're going to actually invest a pool of money in a DAO, I think. That was my recollection of it. And kind of thinking about, okay, like how did my childhood impact the way I perceive money and how I spend and what I think are good spends and bad spends, and kind of naming that a little bit, and then using that to inform like kind of what are we actually going to spend and invest on, because these things can be obviously deeply imbued together. So
yeah, great, thank you.
All right, Alia, you had a question.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've enjoyed it a lot. I'm not sure this question is really like in your area of interest, but I'm curious if you've looked into the role of spirituality in the relationship between money and trauma. I feel like this is particularly an area where like self-deception can be even harder to really pinpoint. For example, sometimes a fawn response for trauma can be dressed as like asceticism and like kind of a spiritual perspective of wanting to give to others and focus on other people. But that also doesn't negate that generosity is a genuine character trait, that spiritual asceticism is a real thing. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about this, and if you have found ways to kind of engage spirituality in this conversation in a way that like doesn't dismiss or erase spirituality.
That's a really interesting point. Like the first thing that came to my mind is spiritual bypassing. Like kind of like, oh, I'm going to like, but maybe in like a different way, like, oh, I am this elevated person, so therefore I need to give, and give. Is that kind of what you're touching on? And how that could show up as a stress response in certain groups?
Yeah, I was actually thinking spiritual bypass when I was thinking of like how the fawn response might show up with money trauma. Like I think someone can like avoid looking into their money trauma by saying like, oh, actually it's just a spiritual way of approaching this. So I feel like spirituality can really complexify the relationship between like identifying money trauma and like working on it. Spirituality can sometimes be the thing that actually masks the person from seeing what it actually is.
That's a super interesting perspective, and I'm going to write that down as well. If you have anything to share, like in regards to that, I'd love to hear about it actually.
I don't think I have much to say because it's just something I'm really interested in. I think like I'm just really interested in trauma in general and how it affects things, and finding ways to integrate like spirituality and trauma. Like how does one acknowledge the reality of trauma without completely erasing spirituality? Because a lot of times like trauma perspectives, I think, can make it seem as though everything is just a trauma response, like your personality trauma response, your spirituality trauma response, like everything becomes trauma response. So then what's real and what's like just a coping mechanism? So.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, I think they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I mean, just going back to like the basic books, like, you know, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, and the work of Thomas Hübl, like it's inherently spiritual in so many ways, but spiritual bypassing is the first thing that came up of like, you know, if you just jump straight to kind of, we are all one and everything is fine and the world is a generous place, and you don't kind of go through that journey of acknowledging the deeper shadows within yourself and the world around you, then like it can, I think, make us extremely disconnected. And in the same way, I think if we kind of stay just within the trauma realm the whole time as well. I went on a pretty cool event recently with Anna Marie, and these were kind of part of the discussion as well. Kind of how do we hold both a little bit? But I can definitely see that the fawn response thing as part of it too. I imagining like a spiritual leader or something kind of going to that response and using those narratives to disguise it. It's, yeah, extremely perverse and fascinating.
We should have a Stoa session on spiritual bypassing and perhaps psychotherapy bypassing as well. Something exists. Manik, let's go with Doug first, and then Manik. Doug, you had a question or clarification.
Sorry. Okay, I wasn't expecting to have to talk.
Hi, Doug.
Hey, Miho. It's good to see you.
You too.
Let's see. Well, all I can do is just read what I wrote. Yeah,
You
it's
had
trying to understand. Yeah,
Mhm.
okay. Trying to understand what you were meaning by container, because I'm sorry if I missed it somewhere, but I wasn't really quite grokking what you meant by that. And then maybe connecting with my question about culture and several things you said about that had the word contextual.
Mhm.
That I'm wondering if there's some relation between the word container, whatever this, the concept of container, the thing of container, whatever it is, and context from a sort of systems thinking point of view, biological point of view.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, totally. Like, I think by container, I mean, just very, very simply, like, you in a friendship group together, you at the workplace, you kind of, I don't know, in a church or somewhere else, or amongst another group, another community that you're in, or maybe a digital container that you're creating for other people to navigate any kind of economic, financial related thing on. That's what I mean by that.
So those could all be contexts.
And they would be context.
With a certain kind of
Yes, they would
framing.
be context too. I mean, it depends on like how I mean, it's like it could be like, you're in a friendship group and you're thinking about like what you want to buy together as friends, or that's context, or you're in an argument, and how people handle conflict within the argument. I think that's what I mean by that.
And they could all be sort of subsets or little bits of a larger culture, or cultures plural.
I suppose so. Yeah. I mean, or culture kind of, I think, helps us inform also like what's acceptable or non-acceptable within those containers.
Yeah,
We could
because
talk about it more
exactly.
afterwards.
That's I was thinking of that culture being the larger container, if you will.
And those contexts, I guess, like, I mean, I'm speaking as like I'm thinking as I speak, like are informed by the bigger cultural container.
Right.
Yeah. Or you can do it the other way around as well. Like you can kind of within your mini context create a different culture, and that goes out into other places too.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But I don't want to go
relations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Doug. Monique, you had a question.
Yeah. I don't know if it's so much a question, but I did write a little bit about it, and the last few comments ago, the discussion on spirituality made me think of that too. Is that we're living in this time where, thanks to the many digital platforms, we're all so much closer and listening to everybody's larger themes of, you need to be spiritual, you need to have enough money, you need to have this wonderful life. There's the romanticization of capitalism, as you mentioned, and spirituality. Also, this you should have some sort of, or you shouldn't. So there's two sides to that. But what is tied into money trauma and different types of trauma is also the shaming of trying to go and dig into spaces or that unravel these larger expectations, romanticize capitalism, because you must have this life because that's what drives us, right? And you mustn't question too much. You mustn't be too spiritual, or you mustn't be too questioning of the systems that are giving you things that you should be grateful for. So, there's all these dialogues. So no, absolutely. That's, I mean, a lot of people that we all know live in these things of don't question, my wonderful job and where this money comes from, because, that's it. So, but the thing is, so I think my question to you is how much you hit the resistance against going too deep into honoring the emotional body experience versus what is much more easier as a product designer, probably, but is much more lucrative and, sexier to do in the tech circle that I'm fully aware of. But, if you worked only with really inclusive and respectful tech design, then I guess not. But somewhere, I was just wondering if you came across that, because each of these things have very different meanings to people, and they're as varied as our psychologies are. So spirituality isn't one thing. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I've been met with resistance before. Yeah. No, I don't like, let me think about how I want to respond to that. Let me hold that question a little bit more. Yeah, I mean, this is a extremely kind of difficult subject to think about for people. Initially, I thought like maybe money trauma is easier to talk about than relationship trauma because it's less intimate, because it's more on this projected object that's outside of me and a relationship to another human being. But the more I explore it, the more I'm like, no, not necessarily. It really, really depends on the people. I think that I have been met with resistance before in like workspaces with tech people and non-tech people. And I think I will be met with even more. And my kind of fear and hope is also that like I think on a one-on-one with people, like people are most like willing to talk about this. Like, I feel shame with money, but that kind of remains contained, just within the personal realm and never gets transferred into like, okay, how are we going to change things differently? How can we actually question what we're doing in a more fundamental way now that we've kind of acknowledged the personal part of, maybe we're creating a system that exploits people or gamifies things that end up exploiting people, right? I think that's going to be something I continue to kind of encounter as I move forward with this journey. And I would love to learn from anybody who knows how to move past that and beyond it too. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
So if anyone has any question, pop your hand up maybe, because we've reached all the questions in the chat. Let's give a couple moments for that. Other than that, if we got Guy, this might be the last.
Hello, Guy.
Yes, I one of the most interesting quotes in the presentation was money is to be able to support our quest for meaning, which reminded me of Ellie and Joe's presentation here about rebuilding on society on meaning. And I saw you thank them at the end. So maybe you could mention more about how this kind of undoing the trauma response to money could possibly tie into that larger project of rebuilding society on meaning.
I love this question. Ellie is my best friend, and we have kind of over the last few months thought about like, how does this relate to each other? We have a feeling it's kind of related, but just for everyone else, like Ellie and Joe are working on trying to develop essentially a literacy for meaning. And like for people to individually and collectively be able to identify like what are ways that we want to live between each context. Like maybe I want to face a situation more honestly, maybe like more authentic relationships give me meaning. And we kind of spoke for past few months, like we have a feeling it's linked, but we're not exactly sure how quite yet. But the more I kind of dive into this, the more I realize that I think trauma and meaning are very, very tied together. One of the first steps in one of the somatic healing kind of step structure is to be able to identify what's really, really meaningful to us and trying to imagine an alternative way to live that feels maybe possible. And if it feels not possible to kind of go there, because we cast it away as impossible because of our economic circumstances or previous fears, we can look at that as well and look at the way that we're acting out in stress responses too. So I think a literacy for the way we really want to live in our lives, as well as the way we're getting in the way of ourselves, you know, maybe can live together.
Any follow-up share question, Guy?
I think it also relates to the 12-step thing. Like one of the 12 steps, I believe, is kind of reimagining one's relationship with the divine. And so it's kind of putting like a more profound relationship to reality in place of the addiction. And I think maybe this could also help with the money trauma as well, because money is obviously a proxy for like everything that we don't have, everything that we are lacking. Like money will fix everything. And maybe if you put something more profound, something that is like deeply meaningful, because money is basically what meaning we give it. Whereas if we put something that's maybe more profoundly sacred in its place, it could actually help us reconfigure our relationship to our whole life, essentially.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think, first of all, I'm going to check out the 12 steps thing. And after that, it's kind of moving beyond just, you know, a group of people and their relationship with money as well. Like, I think, you know, my kind of question is, how can this 12-step thing be applied in like beyond just the personal as well? Is there, you know, a place we can go to for step number 1, and then tools we can use for step number 2 that actually help us a little bit more? That might be an interesting framework for also me to kind of look at and explore moving forward as well. Yeah, so thank you.
All right, we'll sneak in one last question. Brett, you have a question?
It's a question, maybe it's a comment too. I mean, I'm just struck by your work about the way, you know, you can kind of engage us in these conversations. The money reform movement, like Positive Money, maybe you know about them, Montative, I think Comer in Canada, they use these logic kind of campaigns, like this is how the system works and this is all the things it does. But I'm just wondering if there's a kind of connection between this type of work to engage people more in reform, because there are already movements out there to change the system and make it address some of these concerns, and particularly the scarcity that so many of us live with because of the way money is allocated. And so legally it could be changed, but we just don't have the movement, we don't have people engaged. And this angle, the way you're seeing this, seems like a more human way to draw people in to a reform and redesign kind of moment.
Thank you. That's a big compliment. Thank you. I am trying to get more into the I guess big world of new economics, alternative economics. I'm going to be working with the Post-Growth Institute soon. And I want to kind of see these like activities in practice, and think a little bit about like, because at the moment, like I've kind of proved to myself and the people I've done workshops with that this is a topic worth exploring. It obviously touches a lot of people. And to be completely honest, now I'm just like, okay, where am I going to be of the most service? And that's a path of exploration for me. So that gives me more curiosity. So thank you, Brett.
Where I can be of most service is a delicious question to live with. So we'll gently close here. Before I make any closing announcements, I'm curious, Miho, anything from the exchanges of this session that stayed with you and you're going to incorporate in this living inquiry that you're on? That's the first question I have to close. And the other one is anything, any website or things that are coming up for you that you'd like to point people to STOA or who are watching today toward?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those questions. I'm always so touched by how much this topic touches people. And it always lasts with me for a very long time, I think, when people also personally share how much they resonate with it. I think I'm realizing how pervasive the subject is the more I kind of go into it. And I'm really, really kind of like wanting to explore more deeper transformation methods, also the ones that some of the people here have suggested as well. So that is what I'm leaving with. And in terms of websites and stuff, I would love if you followed my Substack. So that's moneytrauma.substack.com. And if you want to contact me, I am on Twitter at Miho Soon. Yes, this is my turtle question. So I am really, really like welcoming more and more people to kind of come with me on this journey. Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. So I'll make some closing announcements in a moment, but Miho, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today. Definitely check out her Substack. I liked her 2 articles that she's has so far, and I put it in the chat. It's also going to be on the video description. And we're going to have a bunch of, in April, a lot of somatic kind of trauma response type of sessions. So stay tuned for that. We're going to be exploring the knife's edge here at the Stoa. And next week, our friend John Ravecki and Chris Masturbetro are coming back to be in conversation with Chris Kavanaugh and Matt Brown on a session on wisdom signaling and the wisdom of criticism. So they're from the Decoding the Gurus podcast. So that should be a interesting dialogos. So you can RSVP on the stoa.ca. So that being said, Miho, everyone, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today.